burdens at your feet and find new freedom in you. So speak to us now through your word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So I didn't realize that Jesus had posed for a photo that could be put on here for the squirrel to look at, right? So, there was a point in time, I don't think you could have gone into very many houses in the United States that claim to be Christian families with this photo. That picture wouldn't have been there. Maybe not so much anymore, but how many people here are familiar with Hogan's Heroes? Okay. For you young people if you've never seen Hogan's Heroes, I really need you to do a little research for me, right? There's this guy by the name of Major Hochstetter. Hochstetter is a Gestapo major. He loses his mind every time Colonel Hogan, who's the senior POW in this German prisoner of war camp, every time he comes into the room. And his perennial question, he has two questions that he'll ask. It's either who is this man? And he's just like freaking out when he says it, right? You just see all this emotion and all this anger, but he gets all squinty-eyed, and who is this man? Or the other question is, what is this man doing here, right? Because sometimes Hogan shows up in places they don't really want him to be. And it's a great show, and you need to go, if you're looking for some good laughs, good clean laughs, you can go back and watch Little Hogan's Heroes, but you need to find Major Hochstetter and just see him lose his mind. But that's kind of the image I have with the question that I had was, who is this man? Because that's a question that runs rampant, actually, through the Gospels. And it focuses in different ways in the Gospel of Mark. But that's the basic question, in many ways, that Mark is trying to answer. So, before we get too far, though, let me mention some songs to you. So one of the songs I was thinking about was the chorus, Stand Up and Bless the Lord Your God. Did y'all ever sing that? Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. You used to go with that. Blessed be your glorious name, O Lord, which is... Okay, well, we'll try another one. How about the song, He Touched Me? Right? You know that one, right? And that one fits really well with, like, the story from last week about the leper in the Gospel of Mark. One of the reasons I think why that story moves me so much when I talk to you about Jesus putting his hand on that guy and the wave of emotion I experienced is because I think in my own way I have experienced that. And I've seen that happen with other people as the Lord touched them, right? But he touched me. Oh, he touched me. And oh, the joy that floods my soul. Something happened, and now I know he touched me and made me whole. Right, and there's some great verses there. It's not exactly like what we do with some of our praise and worship, but it's a great song to remind you about the fact that we've been touched by the Savior and we've been changed. Right? There's another one that I want to share with you real quick. Because this one goes with the passage today. Anybody familiar with the hymn, Till the Storm Passes By? In the dark of the midnight have I oft hid my face, while the storms howl above me, and there's no hiding place. How's that for a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, right? Mid the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over and the thunder sounds no more. Till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast and let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Now, see, I think the disciples could have written this. Mosey Lister's the guy that wrote it, but they could have written it once they got over and landed on that shoreline, thinking about what they'd just been through, right? I wasn't familiar with this song until I heard it on a Gaither homecoming video shortly before I deployed to Iraq the first time. And the position I had when we were at, it was called Camp Cook when I got there, and then they called it Fob Cook, and then it became Fob Taji, and they kept changing the name every time we turned around. We were on the north side of Baghdad, but we were a pretty large area, and we had an airfield right in the middle of it. That was a very active airfield. So those who were part of the insurgency would come driving down the highway next to our FOB with rockets or mortars in the back of vehicles. And if they had rockets, they could launch several of them at a time, right? And some of them were almost like a firecracker as far as they just had a fuse on them and they light them. But, so they had no idea where they were going once they lit them because they're going this way, on the right? So it throws off the trajectory. But it made for a lot of interesting moments. Just to be places, and all of a sudden your stuff go, kaboom, right? And depending on where you were, the concussion then that would hit the building, even if the blast hit quite a ways away from you, still there would be this wave of concussion. I just remember being in this little chapel building we had, and it had been a former Iraqi maintenance bay. And it had two little metal doors. And the stuff hit out by the airfield, and the doors sucked open. And then they came back with the concussion. I thought they were going through the wall on the other end of the building. They hit so hard. But anyway, that was my theme song when I was in Iraq the first time, though, that song. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of your hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. So, what do you know about the Gospel of Mark? Let's talk about it for just a second before we get into it. It's written by Mark, also known as John Mark. He's the nephew of Barnabas. You can find several references to him in the Scripture. He's with Paul and Barnabas when they set out on their first missionary journey, and they get a little ways, and there's some hard times, and all of a sudden, as soldiers would say, he popped smoke, and he went home, right? And we don't really know why he left. One of the early church fathers, I think it was Origen, said that he went home because he missed his mother. But whether he was homesick on this journey, whether they had encountered some persecution and it suddenly just kind of rattled his cage, if you will, one theologian had suggested, well, maybe it's because Uncle Barnabas wasn't getting the billing that Paul was, and he just was frustrated with it. You don't really know. The Bible doesn't tell us. All we know is that Paul was really irritated with him then. Because when they started going on their second missionary journey, and Barnabas wanted to take them along, Paul wasn't having it. And because of that, Paul and Barnabas part ways. Now, what does Barnabas' name mean? Anybody know? Speak a little louder, Sally. Son of encouragement. Barnabas. Son of encouragement. Bar is the Hebrew word for son. Just like when you have bar mitzvah, son of the law. Barnabas takes him, and what do we find out later on? Over the years, later on, Paul will say, John Mark is useful to me. But he was ready to write him off early on, right? But along the way, John Mark becomes the companion of the Apostle Peter. And so what we have in Mark's gospel are basically probably the stories as Peter told them, and how over time then Mark wrote some of those down. He's writing to the church primarily in Rome initially. And Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is written to be like a manual for discipleship. And in a sense, it's a manual for people who are seeking to be sincere followers of the Lord Jesus Christ in the midst of a world of persecution. If you're familiar with 1 Peter, chapter 4, he's just talked briefly about the gifts that we have, right? And then he says something about God be glorified, but he has an amen there, which sounds like the letter's supposed to end. And then suddenly, chapter 4, verse 12 of 1 Peter, do not be surprised at the fiery trial. And I've got a couple of friends that are pretty good Bible scholars that really believe that it was supposed to end at verse 11 of chapter 4, and they were ready to slap the stamp on the envelope and mail it. And whoops. What did we just hear came from Rome? This raging idiot that we'll call Nero. And that dude was whacked out. If you think some of our politicians are whacked out, and I do believe they are, they're nothing. They don't hold a candle compared to Nero. But the trials had begun, and here's a manual then for people who are trying to stay in the boat with Jesus in the midst of hard times. I've already mentioned there's kind of this repeated question. It's phrased in different ways, but you can see it in chapter 2, you can see it in chapter 6, you see it there at the end of chapter 4, you can see it in chapter 11. Who is this man? Julie got to go to class with me when I was in seminary, and I had a professor who was a really smart guy on the Gospel of Mark, and I had a class in Greek on it, which is one of the reasons I love it so much this day. But he was always had his hand in his pocket while he was lecturing. He always had, I've got keys in there, you can't hear him. He always had a pocket full of change. And so, you know, and it would just make her crazy. Matter of fact, if I mention that name, that's the first thing she thinks of is Dr. Mansfield with his hand in his pocket and all this change rattling, right? But Dr. Mansfield would talk about how Mark is all about the strong Son of God. If you look at the stories, there's the idea, especially with chapter 4 and chapter 5, you might think in terms of a strong Savior and a man of action. So one of the things you see in the Gospel of Mark, though, is you don't have necessarily long teaching sections. It's just these stories about the things that Jesus is doing in the lives of people. And there are two words that are key that kind of give this deal. Because Mark is just like running through this story. You know, some people kind of like plod along and they're telling the details of the stories. Mark's not that guy. And one of them is his use of and. And Jesus did this and that, and then he goes and. You know, it's a little more kind of a elementary kind of way of writing things, but it speeds things along. And then, depending on your translation, the word immediately, or maybe you've got one that says straightway. But you can just go in chapter 1 and just give it a cursory glance, and you can see the and. So he sees Peter, you know, and Andrew there by the shore, and says, "Come, follow me." And it says, "And immediately." Right? Then he sees James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and he calls them, and immediately. They go to the synagogue, and there's a man there, and Jesus speaks this word or does whatever, and immediately. Then he goes to Simon Peter's house, and Simon Peter's mother-in-law is sick with a high fever, which was a very dangerous thing in the ancient world, and Jesus touched her and helped her up, and it says, and immediately the fever left her. You know, but that word immediately pops up, I think it's over 30 times within the Gospel of Mark. And it just keeps it moving along. So instead of thinking like videos where things are kind of going, you know, maybe the way we think now today, you're thinking more like a slideshow, just and it's just moving. And I guess probably the last thing, well, a couple of things that I ought to tell you is, so Mark's written probably sometime in the mid-60s. The temple is still standing when he writes this gospel. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And I think there's reason to believe that Peter was probably still alive when he wrote this. But, all right, so let's think about the story we're going to look at just for a second. So you need to know that the story we're looking at actually begins in the very opening verses of chapter 4. Because that's where you see Jesus get into the boat and begin to teach the people. And then we see this story about the parable of the sower and the soils, right? But then suddenly there's this deal about this explanation. And when they were alone, I think for the longest time I'd read that and think, well, so he told that story and then he left? And it didn't dawn on me until very recently, looking at this passage, that suddenly there's like there's a couple of parenthetical, what I would call parenthetical point or passages within the larger passage, where Mark breaks away from the action to say, this is what he did with the disciples when they were alone. And he explained to them this parable. And then he goes back and he's got some other parables. And then it says, when he spoke to the crowds, he always spoke to them in parables. But when he had I'm paraphrasing now, but when he had the disciples alone, when they were in private, then he would explain the parables to them. You with me? So he's been sitting in the boat. This is Mark chapter 4, verse 1 at least. Verse 35 of Mark chapter 4. When evening came, he said to them, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd, They took him along with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" It's an interesting thing that he did for them what they wanted, and then it scared them even more, apparently, than what the storm did. Because then they're trying to figure out who is he that he could do this, right? Now, I want to tell you, I heard a sermon on part of this years ago, and it's always stuck with me. And the fellow that I was listening to, he's a retired lieutenant colonel. He wasn't a chaplain. He was just an Army officer, but he went on to do some things in a leadership ministry, and he was quite a rascal when he was a soldier. But when the Lord saved him good. But he looks at this story and says, he sees the disciples be afraid. He goes, they couldn't go under. Jesus said they were going over. And there's a part of me that really resonates with that. But one of the things you need to know is that within this short passage of Scripture, if you were looking at it in the Greek, the word mega, or a form of mega, is there 3 times. This is not just a storm. This is a great storm. The word anemometer, that tells the wind speed, right? And so the Greek word for wind has to do with anamu. And this is megale anamu, which has to do with the idea there was a great wind. Now you got disciples who, many of them are fishermen, and they've spent a lot of time out on this lake, and they've seen some crazy things happen, because crazy things happen on the Lake of Galilee because of these. There's basically a couple of different passes that channel air down from higher elevations. Mount Hermon is near there, and it's like 9,200 feet, I think, to the top of it, and they're down below sea level. And the thing with temperature inversions and all this kind of stuff, it just gets really crazy. But at night, that doesn't tend to happen, which is why they fished at night. So suddenly, as they head out, and the sky is growing dark, this storm comes upon them. It said they took him just as he was. And it's a little awkward when you read that in the verse to know, does that mean just as he was because he was already sitting in the boat? Or does just as he was describe something about how tired Jesus was from all that he's been doing, because he's going to go to sleep on that cushion in the back of the boat? So for the longest time, we had no clue what a boat like that would have looked like. Then in 1986, the lake level dropped due to a drought. And in the mud on the shoreline, quite a ways down from where the typical shoreline is, they found the remains of a boat that they've carbon dated back to sometime between about 120 BC and 40 AD. It's 26.5 feet long, it's 7.5 feet wide, and it's about 4.5 feet deep in the middle. It would have had a small deck at the back of the boat and one at the front, so you could stand on it when you're casting the net, right? And the person that's driving, or the person who's just hanging out with their ukulele singing, little songs to encourage the rest of the crews back there. And then you've got kind of that open spot, because that's where the nets are going to go with the fish, right? It would have been set up to have had 2 people rowing on each side. The original 4-wheeler, I guess, right? But they are caught suddenly in this great storm. It's unlike anything that the disciples had ever seen. And so I'm going to make a reference here, and I'm going to tell you why I'm going to say it. But the language when Jesus calms this storm is why I'm going to make my reference here. Michael Card, in his commentary, and some others that I've read, believe that this was actually a demonically inspired event, or demonically powered event, because there's no other way to describe exactly suddenly what has happened to them. And yet Jesus is asleep in the midst of it. Now, part of that says something about his own faith, right? He's not going under because he's going over. And I think maybe the disciples maybe have forgotten that this is what he said we're going to do, so it's going to be okay. But it puzzles me. Apparently, they wait until it is full crisis mode before they try to wake him up. And if you just look at the language of how they woke him up, hey, teacher, don't you care that we're about to die? I mean, there's something about the way it's expressed that would lead one to believe they were rude in the way they said it. And several of the commentaries I looked at stressed that idea that just the way they spoke to him was just kind of off the chain, or off the chart, if you will. In Matthew's gospel, he uses the word seismos. Has to do with the shaking, right? Seismology, the science of understanding how things shake and the earth movement, but almost as if there was like a quaking that's going on. But Mark uses this phrase, megale anamu. You could use that to win friends and influence people this week, right? Megale anamu. I hope while we're having harvest, there is no megale anamu. And just, your crew will be impressed, David, trust me. So, don't you care? Now, one of the things that's interesting is how Jesus responds. If I'd have been the guy asleep on the pillow and you woke me up yelling at me like that, I might have rebuked you before I rebuked the wind and the waves. But he responds in his humility and just does what needs to be done, right? So he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, now this ESV, it says, hush, be still. Other translations might say, peace be still. And I want to suggest to you that those translations are inadequate. Not because I'm a great Bible scholar, I wish I was. But the word that he uses, it's, so you could be like this. You can translate peace be still, and that's okay. You can say hush, be still. But a good way to say it might be quiet and be muzzled. Be muzzled. And that phrase, be muzzled, which typically just translates, like when he's casting a demon out of somebody and he tells them, be quiet, get out of here. That's the same idea, though, behind that word, be muzzled. And that's one reason why some of the scholars think this is a demonic attempt to wipe out Jesus and the disciples. Now, at the same time, there were other boats with them. So if you want to think about what Jesus has just done for the guys in his boat, it's not. There's a much larger act of mercy here. We don't know how many boats are with him, but that's an eyewitness detail that he must have got from Peter, that there were other boats out there with us. And you have to assume that they were all in danger, right? And Jesus stands up, and so when it says, and the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. Now that one says a great calm. That's really how it ought to be translated, because it was the word calm has the word mega with it. There was a great storm, and there was a great calm. And the disciples who were so afraid prior, then he's talking to them. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And part of what he's challenging with, did you not have faith in me to see you through this? You got to wonder, just by their responses, so you woke the guy up and asked for help. What did you expect him to do? Was he supposed to grab, the mast and say, man of the lifeboats, every man for himself? I mean, because this picture suddenly of where they're afraid of him is just kind of an amazing thing. And what do you think Jesus was doing at that point in time? Is he puzzled by them? Is he disappointed? If he's disappointed, I don't think he's like glaring daggers at them or anything. I think the look he'll have for them is one of compassion. But they've seen some stuff, right? They've seen him touch the leper and speak to the leper, and suddenly this guy who stank to high heaven, whose skin would have been sloughing off of him, had skin like a brand new baby. Right? They were there. when the roof's getting tore off the house, and Peter shouldn't have forgot about that because we believe it was at Peter's house. As a matter of fact, he still may be working things out with State Farm to get that roof repaired for all I know. But, you can imagine Peter losing his mind, looking up and seeing his roof getting ripped off. But, when they know that Jesus knows what the religious leaders that were there were thinking, and then he responds to them so that you will know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. I say to you. He turns away from them, right? I say to you, take up your mat and walk. They've seen that. And they've seen some other stuff, right, going on through chapter 3. So it just puzzled me that you ask for help, and then are you surprised when you get it? So the third mega has to do with their fear. When it says they became very much afraid, this is the NIV, right? No, ESV, right? But that says filled with great fear. They had a great fear. One translation says, and they were terrified. So one of the ways to maybe wrap our arms around that, or wrap our minds around it too, and well, let's do this. Let's make sure we understand. So, it talks about the fear of the Lord in the Bible. This is not, the word's not being used in that sense, that suddenly they had great reverence, greater respect. No, they were scared. Who is this then, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Each time Jesus reveals himself in a new way or a deeper way, this is their experience. There's a place there until they get past it where they're afraid because they're just like, what do we just come in contact with? And part of it, I think, is the whole Jewish thing. Can you see the face of God and live? Can you go into the Holy of Holies if you're not the high priest without having a rope tied around your ankle where they can drag you out because you just died back there, right? So I think part of it is just this fear of the holy that they had. But as they find out more and more about him and who he is and his identity and the scope of what he's come for. See, they were, when they hitched their wagon to his star, if you will, right? It had to do with the idea that they were looking for a Messiah. And they're looking for someone who can throw the Romans out, establish, Jerusalem as the capital of the world, make the Jews, just put them with their thumbs and their overalls to really be somebody. Or their suspenders, as the case may be. But he was going to end oppression for them and establish them. Mount Zion would be the highest mountain on the earth, and to be all these things that they're hoping for. And so in one sense, he's failing those expectations while he's meeting a much larger set of expectations. Expectations that are there in the Scripture, but expectations that they and the religious leaders failed to piece together. So when he asks them about their fear, then one of his concern for them is, have you lost heart? One of the commentaries I was looking at said that the real threat to faith comes not from lack of knowledge, but from doubt and fear. Andre Crouch had a song years ago, and it was about this idea that how could it be that somebody like you could love somebody like me? And there's a line in there about, sometimes it causes me to tremble. Sometimes it causes me to shed some tears. Sometimes it causes me to tremble when I think somebody like you could love somebody like me. And I don't have the soul to do the song right, just so you know. But I think about that song as I'm looking here, because sometimes it causes me to tremble. You ever had times when you just, maybe you've been someplace and God was so real, and there's an aspect of it that's maybe a little fearful? Because you're just wondering, like when the disciples are on the Mount of Transfiguration, most translators will have Peter saying, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And probably there should be a question mark. And there were Peter, because they see these luminous figures, right? They recognize something extremely powerful and awesome is happening, something holy. And more than likely, Peter actually was saying was, Lord, is it good for us to be here? Because what does he offer to do immediately? Let us build 3 shelters. So, and it was the idea that so those guys could hang out? No, it was for their protection. If I can't see you, I'm safe, maybe is what they were thinking. All right. So then the real question, though, is this. When they're in this fear that they experience, will that fear lead them to deeper trust? Will it morph into something else? Will it change to something else as they have this growing recognition about who Jesus is, His power, His majesty, the wonder of who He is? And so that brings you back then to that question. I phrased it, who is this man? A couple of translations here say, who then is this? I think the New King James says, who can this be? Who can this be? So let's just think about that question for a moment, and that's, and then we're going to quit. We'll sing a song, but we'll quit, okay? So, I think it's important for us as believers to get a handle on that question. Because I'm not sure that all believers, all people who say that they believe in Jesus Christ and they've trusted themselves to Him, have a really good handle on who is this man. So that our knowledge of Him ought to be a growing thing. And one of the reasons it needs to be growing is then you're going to encounter people who have no clue who this man is. Well, I think he's a good teacher. I was in an educational thing the other night, and this lady was talking about some challenges that had come to her family, and she mentioned how her 15-year-old suddenly had decided he didn't believe in God, and he didn't think there was a Jesus. And I just wanted to go, time out. You just need to tell him there's more historical evidence for Jesus than there is for him. Hello? And I'd have been as serious as a heart attack when I said it, because there's an abundance of historical evidence for a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Even if you don't want to acknowledge him as the Son of God, you cannot ignore the fact that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who was born sometime around, actually the dating's also probably about 4 years BC, who died on a cross, was crucified by the Romans. You cannot historically deny that. Anybody that tries to do that, maybe I shouldn't even go there, right? What would I want to call them? One time we were driving, this is years ago, we were pastoring Rosedale. We were going out to see Julie's folks, and I'm cutting through Kansas City, and this UPS driver with a tandem cut me off. I said, "Oh, you idiot." I went past him, got on down the road a little ways. Here he came again. And what did I hear from the voice in the back seat from Levi? Here comes the idiot. Well, anyway, you want to be careful what you call those who don't share your way of thinking, right? But we need to be able to answer some of that question for them. Oh, no. There is an identity for this man. And if you're serious about knowing about it, I can help you with that. Right? We ought to be able to state in some way, this is what this man has done for me. And I am different, right? Just like what you were saying. I was this, and now I'm that, and the key feature to that is Jesus in the middle. It's a brilliant thought. Okay, so can we take just one second and just think back about this passage just for a second? If you were reading it right at the house and you were thinking about it just with kind of with your imagination, I mean, like what did you hear? Disciples into this boat in the midst of the storm. I mean, you hear the boat creaking. I'm imagining there's some thunder and lightning for one thing. And I'm just thinking, being out on a lake with thunder and lightning is not a good thing to be, right? Although at least it wasn't a metal bottom boat, so. But just the water hitting you in the face, the wind. I'm assuming the wind is probably screaming. Maybe you hear some sort of creaking of the boat. At the moment Jesus says, "Be quiet, be muzzled," what do you hear? What I imagine is suddenly the water is just practically as smooth as glass, but I just want to imagine the boat's kind of rocking back and forth a little bit. Maybe you hear just the creaking of the boat itself, right? What's it like, though, to be a water-soaked disciple trying to take all that in? Okay, so as you're reading these passages, we're trying to read slowly. We're trying to read with a little imagination, not trying to make things up, but just what would it be like to be there? Trying to read prayerfully. Teach me, Lord. And then if there's something here to be obedient to, let's be obedient to it. And I think the obedience piece for us in this is, again, that question. Who is he? And what difference does it make? And if I'm a believer, how do I share that with others? Can we pray together and we'll sing a song? Lord, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for your love, and we thank you for your word. Lord, some of us have known some great storms. And I pray, Lord, that if there are those of us maybe that might feel like we're in the midst of a storm right now, that somehow we might know the great calm that you can bring. And then help us to grow in trust and to be able to share with others what you mean to us. And so we bless you and thank you in your holy name, Lord. Amen.